Can you hear us all right, Corey?
Yeah.
Okay, good. And I'll turn the volume up for you so that up all the way, yeah, okay. All right, well, welcome. Let's go around and do a little roll call and introduction so we all know who we are. I'll kick us off with Jared Stewart, Willow City, and staff for the Historic Preservation Commission. So let's
Rebecca Peterson, I'm on the commission.
Ken Spence, I'm new to the commission and I'm also recently on the Downtown Alliance.
And Rebecca and Ken are both new to the commission, so it's kind of funny. Like
First meeting.
we had a January, and we had our 3 veteran members that were here, and now none of them are here, and you guys are here. So although they are all very responsive and involved, so I don't usually they're typically here. So, anyways, but. Thank you, Rebecca.
I'm Sherry Murray Ellis, and I'm a consultant hired by the city to prepare the actual document for the nomination.
Amber Anderson, I oversee the historic rehabilitation tax credit program, which are a major benefit of Willow City.
Okay.
And I'm Corey Jensen. I run the National Register program. So happy to be here.
Thank you, Corey. So I did have our minutes from January, which is kind of funny because the 2 commission members who are here were not here in January, but you now have a copy of these exciting minutes. So I don't know, we could put off approving these until a later date if we want, so that people who are there can look at them as well. But I think that's, at least you have those in a good summary of what we talked about last time too. Anyways, I think we can probably just approve those in the future. So, and more updates, I'll give more updates later on about our PLG project from 2022 as well. So give some updates there, which that's what's funding our conversation today and our historic nomination project, I guess. So I can't remember who needed to go first. On the agenda, we have Corey, then Amber, then Sherry. Is that still the order we want to do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Should I take it away?
Yes, take it away. Oh, hey, and we have Paul Smart with us too. Hello, Paul.
All smart and a scabby face.
That's okay. I've got a little bit of that going on too, but
You have a common problem with, sorry.
I actually put sunscreen on today, you guys. You should be proud of me. I was like, I had to walk up to the county and then back, and then the county again to record some documents, and I was like, I'm gonna put some sunscreen on. Like,
How to smart.
This is the 3rd try. The first try is canister thing, burn, burn, burn. Second try is what they call blue light. And the 3rd try is the chemotherapy cream, where you actually burn your face.
well, if a donut hole would help console you, we got some donut holes here. Say the word, we'll pass them down.
Using 1 fewer calendars. My phone went off and said, hey, you have a meeting. My calendar on my fridge says no meetings today.
Well, thanks for making it. Thanks for making
Sorry.
it. So, all right, Corey, we'll turn the time over to you.
All right. Thank you. So whenever we have a historic district being nominated, we like to hold a public meeting to just introduce what the National Register is and what is going on with the district to the public, so that they understand what the process is. And then they also get a little taste of what the history of the district is, as well as the benefits of being listed in the National Register. So all of this today will cover that. I'm going to take a few minutes just to cover what basically the National Register is and what it does and does not do. So let's see if I can get there we go. Okay. So I'll talk about first the benefits of being listed in the National Register, then restrictions.
Corey,
What
I
is
think
required
we
for a
can't
building
see.
to be eligible?
Corey, do you have something you're sharing? Were you trying to share screen?
Yes, I am trying to share. I'm sorry, I thought I did that.
Thank you, Amber. Yeah, we
There we
can't see.
go.
There we go. Now,
Is that
yes.
better?
Yes, that is much
Okay.
better. Thank you.
Okay. So here's what I'm gonna talk about again. So first, talk about the benefits. There's, the main reason we list property on the National Register is to educate the public about our historic resources, since they are the most visible aspect of our past. And almost everybody sees a historic building, whether they know it or not, on a daily basis. But by recognition, we can get the word out that this particular historic buildings were significant for some reason, and they have a history behind them. So through this recognition, we can encourage community pride through education of our history. And then that in turn, hopefully fosters preservation of other resources, getting more people involved, appreciating that they have a historic building or live in a historic neighborhood. So we talk about some benefits of the National Register, and we like to talk about incentives in that regard. So the number one on that list, which Amber will talk about in more detail, are the rehabilitation or what we call the preservation tax credits. Sometimes there are other financial incentives, such as using the CLG grants to do work on properties that are already listed in the National Register. And then there can also be some building code leniency and zoning variances available for historic buildings that may be used for public purposes, which is, primarily what this historic district is commercial and public buildings. So by far, the biggest driver of getting properties listed in the National Register is so the property owners can get the tax credits. That's what drives most of the nominations here in Utah. So every week, at least once a week, I will get an email or a phone call, either saying, somebody calling saying, I'm curious about listing this building because I want to protect it.
Corey, hold on just a second. We lost our feed on the projector. It just,
Oh, okay.
and
Can
we
you
can
still
hear,
hear me now?
so just a moment. Sorry about that.
Okay.
I hate it when that happens. You guys.
The technology's great, no, it's not. There we go.
All right, we're back. Proceed.
Okay. So I get the question a lot is if the National Register will protect a building from being demolished or if it places any restrictions. So I get people from opposite ends curious about the National Register for those two reasons. And I can say unequivocally that the National Register does not place any restrictions or regulations or recommendations for use on a property. Any building that is listed on the register can potentially be altered or demolished without any penalty other than it would be removed from the National Register. And also along with that, a building does not have to be in perfect condition, perfect historical condition to be listed in the register. It just has to have a good reflection of the period of significance for which it's significant. So a property can be altered, but to what degree will determine if it stays on the register or not. Minor alterations are fine. But again, as I said, if say a property is on the register, then the owner decides to build a huge addition that really overpowers the historical part of the building, or if they decide to knock down that building to build something new, the only result would be just to have it removed from the register. The place where local or where any kind of restrictions might happen would be through local ordinances at the city level. And those are all determined through their preservation ordinance. And so that would be a completely separate process. And we have to remind cities not to base their ordinance on properties being listed in the National Register, because sometimes cities in the past would have an automatic feature that is, if that building was listed in the National Register, it would automatically go on the local landmarks register if they have one. But that has to be a separate process because One is a federal process, the other is a completely local one. So those are the only restrictions. So hopefully that will assuage some fears about getting listed in the National Register. So to be eligible for listing in the National Register, and this is for all properties in general, not just historic districts. But the building must be at least 50 years old, unless it has exceptional significance tied to a broader significant historical theme, or it has exceptional historical significance and it's not yet 50 years old. Those are very rare cases. Second, the property must retain good historical integrity. And as I mentioned, it can have minor additions or alterations, but they just can't have a major impact on the historical appearance of the building. And then finally, it must meet one of the criteria for significance, at least one. And that would be, so criterion A is association with a historical event or pattern of history. Criterion B would be association with a significant person. And criterion C would be for its significant architecture or artistic merit. So there's also a criterion D, but that mostly applies to archaeological sites that may yield information through survey work and further research at the ground level. This doesn't typically apply to buildings, although it can in various cases. So we're usually looking at criterion A, B, and C, and a property can be significant for all of those or just one. For this historic district, I think it's under criterion A and criterion C, which is the most common combination. So do you have a potential for a historic district? You need to have a good core of buildings that retain historic integrity. This is usually determined through an organized survey, what we call a reconnaissance level survey, which myself and some staff from our office did in the proposed historic district a few years ago. I think it was before the pandemic, we actually surveyed that area, like 2019. That survey provides some important information that is used in the district nomination. So it provides the basic data for all the buildings, the construction date, the type and style of architecture, construction materials, and that kind of thing. But it also evaluates their significance and their eligibility, which is important for district nomination. Then it also provides information for the maps that will be used for the district nomination. And the data, which is the information that Sherry gathered from us as she started to prepare this nomination. So when we talk about historic districts, there are benefits. The purpose for listing a historic district is that it impacts more buildings than an individual building nomination would. Sometimes you will have one significant building in an area, but there are other properties around that area that might retain good historical integrity, but don't really have enough significance, historical significance or architectural significance on their own to be nominated. And when you have a good core of buildings like that, that the sum of their architecture and their history would warrant a nomination, that's when you start looking at a historic district. The benefits of historic districts is that you have a large number of properties that are potentially eligible for the National Register and can then get the tax credits. And cities use this for redevelopment tool to encourage neighborhoods to historic neighborhoods to use the tax credits to update their homes, to repair them and to restore them. And then that in turn hopefully fosters community pride and gets a broader groundswell of people wanting to beautify and make their neighborhoods look better. As we know, historic neighborhoods are usually the first ones to get run down because they've been around a lot longer. So getting a historic district is a good tool to help in that regard. So that is my brief introduction on the National Register. there's a lot more detail than that, especially if you're going to write your own nomination book. Anyway, with that, I'm going to unshare my screen. And I don't know if we have questions from anybody on this, but I'll turn the time over to Amber. And she can talk about the tax credits. And I don't know, maybe if there's questions, we can just do that at the end.
Corey, are you gonna be able to share that presentation? I think, I was just thinking as, because I have these other two, we could post this up on our city website and then on YouTube, but then link to those presentations, I think would be great too, if you're willing to share that.
Yeah, I'll send it to you now.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Yes, and I can even, I pulled them up already. And they should be, is it that one? Okay, yeah, perfect. I thought I could just screen share so Corey can see those two, and then we'll get it on the presentation, but then I can just give this to you and then you can click through it
That's great.
if that works.
Corey, can you see the slides? Yes, okay.
He's minding now.
Do full screen on this.
Oh, good question. This is like a different type of PDF thing. Let's see, view probably.
Good start.
And oh my gosh, that was funny. There was a little laugh from outside, yeah. Let me see. I mean, I can zoom in like that. So it's like
It used to be at the bottom of, it's covered up by the.
Zoom.
full screen,
Oh,
maybe.
Yeah, it's covered up by
that's
the
the right button.
controls for the
Need a second.
meeting.
Yep.
There we go. Oh, and then I even advanced it once for you.
Okay,
So okay.
great. All right. Hello. I'm Amber Anderson and I oversee the Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit Programs. Try to like look up there.
And if it's easier, I'm happy to advance.
No, it's okay. I'm just trying to figure out where to look. So there's two historic tax credit programs available here in the state of Utah. One is a residential program where you can get a Utah state income tax credit. One is a federal program, so you can get a federal income tax credit for income producing buildings. And both of these programs provide a credit, not a deduction. I will talk a little bit more about what that means in case you don't know on the next slide. And both programs provide a credit equivalent to about 20% of a project's cost. And in the situation of a residential rental, when you have both residential and income producing, there is sometimes the opportunity to get a combined 40% tax credit. Yeah.
Something today.
In order to qualify for either of these programs, the building has to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, either individually or as a contributing property in a National Register listed historic district. Sherry will probably have a map showing the contributing properties in this historic district. So that's a good starting point to see like which buildings are eligible for this program. The building doesn't have to be listed when you start the historic tax credit project, but it does need to be listed within a few years after, and therefore you should have a good sense that it's going to be listed before you assume that you're going to get tax credits. I also threw this last one in here because this is a relatively, or no, I'm not to the last one yet. Hold on. The second to the last one, all of the work being done to the property has to follow what are called the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. These apply to the inside, the outside, and anything on the site. And I won't get into detail about these today, but essentially the idea is that you identify what the historic character defining features are and then try to preserve them as best as possible. The last one I threw in because a lot of the buildings in this district are commercial. And so syndication is a process where you can allow an investor to make use of the credit. It's not a straight sell of credits. Anyone familiar with tax credits, like some kinds you can sell and get money up front. You can't technically do that with the federal credit, but you can do syndication, which is sort of the same thing. It's just more complicated. But you can syndicate the federal tax credits so that an investor can provide you upfront capital in order to help make a project happen. like I said, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it does exist.
Okay, can I ask a question on
Yeah.
that? So say I owned the Ritz Theater, which I don't, that'd be cool if I did. I could use this syndication tool to say, okay, I don't have the money to pay this contractor upfront for whatever work is being done. How does that, so
So-
basically I could get money from,
So an investor, they would technically, I think how it works is become a part owner, and it might be a
Okay.
tiny part, but a part owner, and then they can use the credit, and then they would give you a person,
Oh,
so
okay.
between 70 to 95 cents on the dollar for your credit upfront.
okay. So I'd maybe have to go and record a deed that says so-and-so is a 1% owner.
Yeah, I
or
don't know,
something, and then they could,
it's something, I don't know that part, but something,
something like that.
something would have to happen
Okay.
in order to open that door. And then most of the time syndication doesn't happen with smaller projects. It's usually start to get multi-million-dollar project. But if you had the right person and the right investor, there's no reason you couldn't do it. It's just out of like, not local investors typically just aren't interested until it's a certain dollar amount, but it doesn't mean that like you couldn't syndicate his project.
Let's do it.
Let's do
Is that?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
that's great. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Sorry to jump in.
No, you're fine, feel free. So also looking at what is a tax credit, it sounds like a pretty simple thing. Most people probably think they know what it is, but a credit is better than a deduction. So a credit directly reduces your annual tax liability dollar for dollar. So your annual tax liability is the amount that you either pay over the course of the year or you pay at the end of the year. It's the net amount. So if you pay too much, you get some back, the net amount, or vice versa. And the credits for these programs are considered non-refundable. Doesn't mean that you won't get them via a tax refund. It just means you can't get more in any given year than your annual tax liability. But you can carry them forward for a number of years if your liability is not large enough to use it all at once. And it depends how far you can carry it forward, depends on which program you're using. So I'll mention that a little bit later. But as an example, if your annual tax liability for the whole year is $5,000, so you pay in 5,000 or you owe 5,000 or however that shakes out, and your credit is 4,000, it means it reduces your liability for that year to 1,000. And then if you've paid more than that already, you would get that back. If your annual liability is 5,000 and you're awarded 6,000, cancels out your liability for the whole year, you get all of it back, and then you still have another 1,000 left for the next year. So credits are better than deductions. So this is our website, hub.utah.gov. I don't know that Tooele has been updated for this district on here yet, but if you go to this website and turn off this architectural surveys layer, that'll just cause confusion if you don't need it. Sherry probably knows. Then you can just have buildings and historic districts on, and you can kind of see this polygon that has like a light yellow or orange shape right here. That's the historic district, and then all of these little dots are the buildings. Green means contributing, essentially. I would take this as a starting point. Don't take it as 100% accurate, because it might not be updated, or there may just be a human error situation, but it's a good starting point to see, is my building in a district? Is it a contributing property? Is it individually listed on its own? So yeah, it's a good resource. Qualified rehabilitation expenses. When I first mentioned how the credits, how much they are, but it's about 20% of your project's costs. Not every expense having to do with your project is a qualified expense, meaning you can't use all of them to calculate your credit, such as the ones on the right. Landscaping, site work, those still have to meet the preservation standards, but you can't use them to calculate your credit. On the left, you can see most of the work being done to the building itself counts, including soft costs like architect fees, permit fees, things like that. And then just a note, if you're looking at the federal versus the state program, the QREs are slightly different, not really substantively, but they are a tiny bit different. So take a quick look at the state credit. As I mentioned, this is for residential buildings. That can be residential rental or owner occupied, a house or apartments in a Main Street building, for example. You have to be spending a minimum of $10,000 in up to a 3-year period, but you can be spending more than that in a shorter period, and there's currently no limit to the number of subsequent applications you can open. You can only have one application open at a time, and anything you're doing to the building has to be disclosed on that application. But once you finish one, you close it out and you start claiming, you could just open another one and start over, as long as you're going to meet that $10,000 spending requirement again. And you don't have to take up to 3 years. You could do a 3-year project that spends $10,001, or you could do a 1-year project that spends $100,000. Like there's no limit currently. I mentioned that all the work being done during the project has to meet some standards, some preservation standards. That's true for an additional 3 years after doing the project as well. You can't do a bunch of good preservation work to get your tax credit and then tear the building down. That's not allowed. And then also at the state level, if your tax liability is not large enough to use that whole credit, you can carry it forward for 5 years.
I guess you could tear it down, but then you'd have to pay back.
Yes, precisely. You would have to pay it back.
Not that we want anything.
No. And then the federal credit, which is more applicable to the buildings in this historic district here in Tooele, I believe, is for income producing buildings that can count for residential rental, but also office, event space, restaurants, anything that has an income producing use. And there's not just a simple spending requirement for the federal program. It has to meet a substantial rehab test, and I will explain what that means on the next slide. And then you have to maintain ownership of the property for 5 years, as well as compliance with those preservation standards for 5 years after the project is complete. The state credit technically does not have an ownership requirement, but it would be difficult to maintain compliance with preservation standards if you didn't own the building. So weird little loophole, but and then the 2 bottom ones have to do with the tax reform that happened in 2017. You can't claim the whole credit in 1 year, even if you have a large enough tax liability. You have to spread it out over a minimum of 5. But then if you still have more, you can carry it forward for an additional 16 or even backwards for 1 year, for a total of 21 years that you could potentially claim this credit if you needed to. It's not super common, I would say, but
It's a lot of years.
yep. Yeah. So this is substantial rehabilitation test is what's used for the minimum spending threshold for the federal program. I won't go into all of this today, but in order to meet that test, your qualified expenses have to exceed what's called the adjusted basis. So I'll just skip forward to that. This is the adjusted basis calculation. So purchase price of the property minus cost of the land at the time of purchase, minus any depreciation taken for an income producing property, plus the cost of any capital improvements made since the purchase. Usually that's rather large, but it really just depends on how long you've owned the building. If you just bought it, it's going to be purchase price minus the value of the land. It's likely going to be a couple $100,000 at least, depending on your situation. But if you've owned it for longer, I just had a project today where their adjusted basis was a negative amount. So there's a minimum of $5,000 you have to be spending. That doesn't usually get used, but so that's the adjusted basis calculation. So your qualified expenses have to exceed that in order to meet this test for the federal program. Typically, you have to meet that test within a 2-year window of your choosing. So you can move it backwards or forwards. The further forwards you move it, the higher that amount's going to be, because you've already started to put capital improvements in if your project has started. And so 2-year window to meet that adjusted basis. Whenever you want to start it, you can count costs from as early before that as you want and up to the year after that as part of your tax credit. You can request a 5-year measuring period to meet that test if these next bullet points apply. I don't know that we need to get into them right now, but here they are. Between the state and the federal program, here are the differences. I won't read them, but the main thing I want to point out is that our office has the final approval for the state program, whereas the National Park Service has the final approval for the federal program. And I and our office work as a liaison. Essentially, we help the applicant make sure they have everything ready to go, make sure they're following the standards. And then the National Park Service also relies on us to make sure that they fully understand what's going on, because they're back in DC and they don't usually come out here and actually check out the projects firsthand.
We should have invited them today.
We could have, yes, we should have. So this, I'll look at both of the applications. This is the federal one, this is the state. The state one is simpler. It's essentially just a before and an after. The before is really important because that's where you show what you started with or are starting with, and then describe in detail what you want to do. If we don't know what you started with and you've already done the work, there's a chance that it will be disqualifying if it doesn't meet the standards. And if you didn't have good documentation and you already started the work, it's really hard for us to determine whether or not the work does meet the standards. So this is an important part. So you submit this, we review it, you carry out the project, then you submit the after application with the after photographs showing that you did what you said you were going to do, hopefully. And then the federal project, the federal application is very similar. Parts 2 and 3 are essentially the before and after of the state. Part 1 is the added process here, and it only applies if a building is not individually listed on the National Register. So any of the buildings in this new historic district, if they were to apply for this process, they would have to do a Part 1, but it's pretty simple. It's just some photographs, a brief description, and a brief explanation of why the building should be considered a contributing property to the historic district.
Which we could probably reference our
Yep, the
survey from
yep,
2019.
the survey, the nomination, a Part 1 is pretty easy to write if it's in a historic district. Review times, if it's a state only project, just residential rental or just residential, I technically have up to 30 days to review the application. I try to do it in much quicker than that, hopefully within a week, if not sooner, sometimes up to 2 weeks, just depending on what I've got going on. Technically, I have 30 days though. If it's a federal application or a federal and a state, we don't make you submit a state application. If you're doing both, we will accept the federal application. The review time for anything that has a federal component, 30 days in our office, but then also 30 days at the National Park Service. Again, I will try to take much less than 30 days. They will take every third of those 30 days. Do not expect that to be done quicker. And then here's just an example. I don't know that these numbers are super accurate anymore. This is the Union Block building in Brigham City, but it seemed like a similar situation to a lot of the buildings, or at least a handful of the buildings here in Tooele on Main Street. It's a mixed use project. So the ground floor has always been commercial. The up floor was historically residential rental and then has been offices in the past. The owner has turned the ground floor back into commercial and is turning the upper floor into residential rental. So with an estimated project cost of $315,000, with 150 of that being residential rental, if you look at 20% for the whole project plus another 20% for that residential 150, you would be looking at $156,000 in tax credits for a $315,000 project. So pretty substantial. And then how to get started? Honestly, my request of everybody is just to reach out. We can make sure that your building is eligible for the programs. We can make sure that the application, you're using the right application, that you're applying for the right program, and we can have an initial conversation about the work plan and if it's anywhere near approvable or if things need to be reevaluated. If for some reason that conversation doesn't happen before a project is started, I would again recommend thorough documentation before touching the building, because that way we can evaluate if what you've already done meets the standards. Projects have been denied in the past for lack of prior documentation if too much has been done and we just can't tell. And then also beginning the application process as early as possible. That way we can get a reviewed work plan before too much work has been done and make sure you're on the right track is ideal. Lastly, here's a bunch of links, a bunch of resources. On the left-hand side, we have what those 10 preservation standards are, but then preservation by topic, the second link is my favorite. It's an alphabetized list of just a ton of guidance on how to meet the standards. So if you go to W, for instance, you could scroll down to Windows, click on Windows. There's like 25 documents about how to repair your windows, how to assess your windows, how to replace them, how to, just a ton of different things. And then we have our 2 tax credit homepages for state and federal. And then I threw an IRS one down at the bottom as well. If somebody is pursuing federal, there's some good guidance on there. On the right-hand side, the financial resources, this is just has a bunch of different guidance on how to pursue tax credits, usually the federal, not the state. There's some blogs, there's the National Trust Community Investment Corporation does actually sometimes serve as an investor for that syndication process. They definitely like the larger projects, but they do have good resources on their website. And then lastly, this webinar at the bottom is a 1-hour webinar that our architect Jansen Bennett and I did after an intensive 3-day long workshop. We tried to just cull all the information down into a 1-hour webinar on how to navigate building code in historic buildings. Because we were hearing a ton from communities like Tooele about trying to rehabilitate these buildings and make the upper floors usable, and how building code is such a hindrance. And so this is a super helpful workshop that we went to, and we're hoping that this 1-hour webinar is really helpful and more digestible to at least be able to start asking the right questions of your architect, your code official, your contractor, just because oftentimes they give you the one option that they know or the easiest one, and you can ask questions, you can push back. There are other alternatives. So please watch this.
I think our building code official also attended that 3-day.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That makes me
Because we
sad.
heard about that seminar or whatever. it
Yeah,
was
the
at the National
Main Street Conference.
Main Street Conference.
Yep, they sponsored it with
So-
the Association for Preservation Technology. Because of this, they kept hearing it too. So yeah, it's great. And here's my contact info. I guess leave it open so that.
Yes, because I do want to find where you've got mine on there.
Yeah, I've got the presentation right here at the bottom.
I just want to reiterate, so folks do approach you, if there are people in the property owners in the district who approach you about it, about wondering about tax credits or any of that kind of stuff. My advice is, if they've hired an architect or they're going to hire or a contractor, get that person with the property owner and talk to SHPO before they start designing anything.
Yes.
Because you could easily spend a bunch of money.
Do you want me to click through it or do you want to?
It doesn't matter.
I'll let you do it.
Because yeah, you can waste a lot of money paying for a design that actually wouldn't qualify.
Yeah.
So
And it's a lot easier to convince yourself of small changes when your heart is not set on a design that you've already seen. Do that a lot.
yes. We're doing, okay.
I thought I liked the numbers though. Seeing that example,
Yeah,
that's a lot of money back,
yeah,
you know?
it is.
And I think that's, it seems like people have a hard time understanding how it could actually help them, you know, if they could see an example like that and say, oh, okay, I can get tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars back.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thoughts, questions from you guys? Before
No, I
we-
like that example too. It looked like it was about a 50% credit.
It's 40, it's like 30% because part of it was 40% and part of it was 20%.
Yeah. Make a huge difference.
Lots of information. We'll get these posted.
Yeah. Okay, so mine is the easier part, I suppose, in some way. I'm talking about the nomination itself, the district, and little tidbits about that, just so you have context for it. And if anybody asks you about it, you all can be the experts now too. So I've got some maps that I'll show next, but the boundaries of the district, these were established essentially through the survey data that SHPO staff gathered in 2019. And they came through, did a survey for the city. They're the ones who evaluated each of the properties, decided whether or not, or gave an evaluation as to whether or not they were eligible or potentially contributing resources or non-contributing resources based on how much they had been altered. And those boundaries, the boundaries that ended up in the nomination are almost identical to the boundaries that came out of that field survey where they drew essentially a boundary around it. Now, the only alteration to that boundary was extending it very slightly further south along Main Street to pick up a couple of additional properties that they surveyed in a subsequent SHPO staff surveyed in the subsequent survey. So we wanted to add those in. So that's the only difference there. But essentially it starts roughly 200 south. There's one building on the north side of 200 south. It's centered on Main Street, right? So basically centered Main Street and Vine. On north is 200 south, and on the south, it's about 160-ish south Main Street. It's about how far south it goes. And then on the east and west, you're looking at 50 West essentially and Garden Street. So back here, that's our boundaries. Within that area, there were 80 total properties. 79 of those are buildings. One is what's the Veterans Memorial Park. That particular park, while the original iteration of that park dated to the historic period, that the park was renovated in around 2006, I think it was, early 2000s, and essentially all of the historical fabric and configuration was destroyed. So that park, technically what you see now is modern elements of the park. The site was park historically, but so that park is not a contributing resource anymore within the district. There's the remaining 79 properties are all buildings, most of which are commercial or public structures. There's only a handful of residential structures left in the district, which is definitely a shift from when the district started, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Out of the 80 properties, there are 48 that are contributing, right? So 48 that would be considered eligible within the district, so that would be listed on the National Register as part of the district if the district gets listed. The remaining 32 are non-contributing, and they are defined as such either because they were built in the historic period but were altered far too extensively, or they were built outside the historic period or outside the period of significance in this case. The period of significance for this district is 1864 to 1973. And those date ranges, we're going to talk a bit about the history of the district. So Tooele, as you I'm sure all know, was settled before 1864. So this does not go all the way back. It does not go all the way back to the settlement era because we don't have any extant structures. We have no standing structures in the district that date to that earliest period. The earliest structure is 1867, which was the old county courthouse city hall building. There is one cabin supposedly on the property of the museum that was built during the settlement period, but it was relocated from somewhere else in the valley, so it does not count as being a historical or a contributing resource within the district. So we've defined that period of significance as starting later after settlement, and I'll give you a little more detail about that start date and sort of why in a minute. So here's the generalized map. 200 south is up there near the top. So you can see the bank building, the circular bank is Key Bank building now. That's the northernmost of the buildings. So it's that little projection up there at the very top of the map in the blue hatching. So that's the bank building. Then going down almost to 160 south, just south of 154 south, I believe, on Main Street is the southern extent. And then you can see the east-west boundaries there. Guess the western boundary does kick over to what, 100 west. So that's quite starting. Stop it at 50 west. So that's the general configuration of the district. It's proposed. It's a little hard to see in this map, but these are all the 80 properties, the 80 resources that are in the district. Everything that has a solid black dot on the figure is a contributing resource within the district. Everything that has a square with an X in it, that is a non-contributing resource. So ones that are either out of period or have been altered too much. So as you can see, I mean, with 60% of the district resources being contributing, it's got a pretty solid foundation and a pretty good core area of eligible structures in there, contributing structures there. And this map, this figure is included in the actual nomination document. So if you want to look more closely at that nomination document and at the map, even, you can pore over that a little bit more. The nomination also does have a table at the very end that lists the properties by address and their contributing or non-contributing status. So if you just have to list that table, you can just refer to that. So yes, so the district history, as we said, we have settlement in 1849 and incorporation in 1853. But we have no resources that are standing in the district date to that period. Then we have, after that, 3 more, within the historic period, we have 3 more, what we call temporal or thematic periods that define the history of the district and to some extent of Tooele as a whole. These periods, what we do when we are establishing these periods, they're really just meant to provide a framework to kind of understand and contextualize the history of the area and the development of, in this case, of the district. They are based on socioeconomic trends. So what's the prevailing trend? Was there a major event that influenced how the city developed, influenced how it changed, influenced whether people were building structures, influenced. So think about the Great Depression, right? Nobody's really building all that much. That's a major event in history. It might mark a certain time in period in history where we say, you know, that really influenced the development of this area in the sense that it influenced no development, right? So we have this gap. So you have these themes that tie into what drives development and the landscape of the city. So we have, using that sort of framework, we've come up with what we call the early mining boom period, which starts in 1864. And we'll talk about that date a little bit in a minute. Goes to 1909. Then we have an industrial development period, which goes basically from 1910 to essentially right to the beginning of World War II. And then we have defense industry period beginning in 42. Now, our terminal period for the period of our terminal date for the period of significance is 1973, which is the current end of the 50-year cutoff for things to be considered, typically for things to be considered historical. So if you remember, Corey said the resource must be 50 years old or older. 1973 is currently the 50-year cutoff. So that's being used because since we're preparing the nomination or listing the nomination this year, we're using that date. There are times where you might not use the 50-year period, just so you're aware. There might be a terminal date that actually makes more sense that's earlier. Or you might have one that you can, if there's exceptional resources that are less than 50 years old, but can also be listed under certain considerations, you might have a period of significance that extends later than just the 50-year cutoff. So let's talk about early mining boom period. So Tooele, or Tuilla, if you want a Spanish pronunciation of it. So this is a 1856 General Land Office map. So this begins shortly after incorporation. So settlement and incorporation has occurred, but it's several years before the period of significance for the district begins. And you can see that's a Main Street. The street that goes down right down, one street down the center is Main Street. And what's really interesting and great about this particular map is that it actually captures the district. This is mostly the district. It just happened to be that that's what was platted. So it's really part of the original plat that existed for Tooele. There's another map that I did not include in this presentation. It's from 1860, which is the official city plat that's over at the museum. It hangs on the wall. So it's kind of hard to get a good image of it. But by 1860, this particular plat that you see in this map now had been expanded and it had been much more refined. So the mid-block alleys, 50 West, Garden Street, had all been platted at that time. The lots on all the blocks had been platted. And it's a really interesting map if you want to take a look at it, the different lots on each of the blocks have different configurations depending on which part of the city you were in and how they intended to develop that land. So this area in the center, which is the district now, had a series of sort of narrow rectangular lots that would extend, say, from Main Street to those mid-block alleys. So they were really long, narrow lots, which certainly influences the type of building that you can put on those and how you use those spaces. So it's not just the structures that are on these properties that reflect the history. It's the configuration of the lots. And how that influenced how they develop those properties. This period, the reason we picked 1864 is that is the year that the Rush Valley Mining District was established. And so we had lots of soldiers from Fort Douglas in the area who would go out, and in the Fort Douglas over in Salt Lake, they would go out and explore in their days off. And some of them, they actually took organized expeditions into the mountains and were looking around, and actually it's a lot of the soldiers that discovered the first mineral deposits in the mountains of the Wasatch Front, Tooele Valley area. And that led to a mining boom. So we had thousands of people pouring into northern Utah and into the mountains to try to lay claims there. Everybody was going to get rich, right? They were going to find their strike. Everybody was going to kind of find a Kennecott copper mine, or at least they thought. And so that had a major influence on people coming into the Tooele Valley to settle here, which meant more housing needed to be constructed, more commercial services needed to be available to those people. So that really starts the development of downtown Tooele and this district. At that time, most of the architecture that was the buildings that were being built used a classical architecture style, so Greek revival or just some other generalized sort of classical styles. In a lot of cases, the buildings within this district are what we might call like a vernacular or a more popular style of classical architecture, not like they're not going to find the quintessential version of classical architecture out here, but you have versions that are adaptations of that, using those themes to build the structures here. And then as we get later into the period some into the 1880s and then into the 1890s and beyond, we start to see Victorian elements in style creeping into the building structure or to the architectural style structure. At this time, and I'm going to show some slides here in a minute, this district was really quite balanced as a mixed use area in terms of residential and commercial. And there were actually quite a few single family homes along the area, along Main Street mostly. And those very, quickly over time started disappearing. And Tooele in that time became the commercial hub of the valley. It still is to some degree, although some of the other satellite communities are developing their commercial areas as well. But it really was, Tooele was the place. This was the place where if you needed goods or services, you came to Tooele to get it. And that lasts through this entire period. And then just some general information, so by 1890, Tooele already had 1,000 residents living here. And a lot of those people came in after that mining district was established and were part of that whole rush, if you will. Within this district, there are only 10 buildings left from this period. And the oldest, of course, the county courthouse shown down there in the bottom, an older 1950s photo, I think it was, or maybe a little bit earlier photo of the building. The remaining 9 of those buildings weren't built until 1890 or later, from 1890 to 1906. So they really kind of represent that latter part of the period. 7 of the buildings are contributing resources and only 3 are non-contributing, which is good. And there's a mix of some commercial and residential. I guess maybe you have an older version or something.
Oh, I don't know.
That's okay. Yes. So I don't have the maps in there, the Sanborn maps, but
They're later on, I think.
Oh,
Sanborn
maybe that's why it's this period. That's why. That's what I was thinking about. Okay. So then the second period, the industrial development period. This is marked by the International Smelting and Refining Company smelter coming into play. They started building it around 1908, 1909, but it did not go into operation until 1910. That facility, built east of town, was a major employer here. At the height of their operations, they were running 3 shifts a day and up to 1,000 workers per shift, which was huge. And you can see I've got a little info in there about just some changes in population size. Not super dramatic, but not not bad for, for a small community. That's a pretty decent increase. When the smelter came in and they needed so many workers, they started sponsoring development of what became known as Newtown, which is the Broadway area. I saw from your notes that you had a survey done of Broadway. That area became Newtown. And the downtown historic district became known as Old Town. And it actually shows up on maps as Old Town, which is kind of an interesting thing. A lot of times I'll just name the new place and ignore the old one, but they changed the name on maps to Old Town for the historic district area of Tooele. Over in Newtown, they primarily, the smelter and Anaconda was another company that was here that started investing in company housing and sponsoring other development to make sure they had enough workers and that their workers had housing. So they started sponsoring residential development, mostly over in that area, to make, they had boarding houses as well as single family homes to ensure that there was housing over there. And then there was commercial development that occurred with that. But that commercial development was really kind of different from what was happening on Main Street at the time, in that the commercial development over in Newtown was focusing on things to directly support the workers that had come in and were now living there. And those workers tended to be new immigrants, a lot from Eastern Europe and other places where they had cultural interests that were different than the general population here. So restaurants, groceries, those types of things, those types of establishments, commercial establishments were started there to directly cater to those specific immigrants and those ethnic groups that did not have representation elsewhere. The Main Street commercial district that we're in now continue to serve the primary and generalized services of commercial and commercial goods and services for Tooele, as well as for the people over in Newtown that they didn't have those resources over there. So it's really kind of an interesting shift there. We also have during this period the Tooele Valley Railroad coming in 1912, which came in through the valley and was largely tied to the shipping of ore and smelted products and things like that, but was used, there was a branch that came from essentially downtown Tooele through the smelter and was used to transport employees every day for their shifts as well. From this period, we have 40 resources still present in the district. 28 of them are contributing, 12 are non-contributing. And we also start to see a shift during this period toward mostly commercial development in the district. And we also start to see the shift in architectural styles being applied to the new buildings that are being built, moving away from classical architecture for the most part in those Victorian styles, which are still present at the beginning of this period. And we start seeing what we call early American styles. So things like bungalows, period cottages, World War II era styles, which we've sort of termed minimal traditional, things that don't have a whole lot of adornment to them, those types of things, boxes, if you will. So there's my slides. So let's see. I'm going to come up here. Easier. So just kind of orientation. Main Street, right here, 200 South, which is actually listed as first one. Names change, just so you know, street names change all the time on Sanborn maps. So Vine Street down here. So this is the northern, like the northern half of the district. And so what you end up seeing, everything is kind of hard to see in this first bit. Everything you see, it's got a D. Has a little D in there. That's a dwelling. That's a residence. So they have all of these things that are here. I mean, all of these, right, for residences. And we have commercial block primarily down at that intersection with Vine Street, similar on the south half of this, I'm only showing the north half here, with a few scattered commercial structures north of that. And this is in 1911. So right at the very beginning of this particular, the industrial development period. So you can extrapolate and say, this is kind of what, or mostly what the district looked like at the end of our very first period, that early mining boom period. So this is where we start when we get into this period. And then by most of the way through my 1931, you'll start to see, I mean, we've got the commercial core that is starting to move north quite a bit. And then you still have quite a few dwellings, but you start to see more commercial structures being placed on the lots that hadn't yet been developed. And so that's the ratio of residential properties to commercial properties is definitely starting to shift by this period. This continues from this point on with really just sort of almost near loss of commercial or of residential properties in that, at least in that northern half of the district. So some of the notable buildings that date from this period, we have the old Carnegie Library from the early part of the period, and then we have the post office from toward the end, near the end of the period. Those are sort of your two anchor public properties anyway. And then we get into the last period, our defense industry period, which obviously Tooele Ordnance Depot, well, Army Depot, whatever acronym and or long-winded name you want to call it. And then we also have Deseret Chemical Depot, which, while not located as close to the city here, still had influence in terms of employees, people needing housing, those types of things, and commercial. So you get both of those, the establishment of those.
Dugway now, Deseret Chemical? I don't even know where that one is.
It's Dugway's across the street. So Dugway's down there too. Deseret Chemical Depot's a little bit north and across the street, across the road. Yeah, so you have all of these military facilities come in, and they have a draw of workers because they are employing a large number of civilian workers alongside the military employees. We also, during this period, get what I refer to as the rise of automobile culture. So you have a proliferation of automobile ownership in the United States and the Tooele area, Utah, no exception to that, in the years after World War II, during and after World War II, which creates an interesting push, if you will, on the landscape in terms of we now have to accommodate cars because everybody's got cars. Whereas previously we had fewer people walked down and pick up your stuff, or they would, even earlier than that, you had wagons, you did whatever it was. Now, so many people have cars that there's not as much parking available to people, or you need to accommodate more parking of vehicles. So we start to see that influence the development of properties within the district as well as outside the district in terms of providing off-street parking. So now, if we're going to provide off-street parking, well, we've got to push the building further back from the road, or we've got, because we mostly want to have people be able to park in front of not park behind and go in the back door, right? So we start to see these differences in how we build our properties and where we place structures on the lot. So the setbacks get deeper, those types of things, in order to make sure that we can accommodate vehicles. The district in general, by the time we get to World War II, almost all of the parcels, all of the lots had been built out. So the new development that we see primarily occurs as redevelopment, where they are tearing down an older building and then redeveloping the lot. We also see situations where, because of this issue of, hey, we need to accommodate parking. And if you remember, I was telling you the original plat, it's 1860, has long, narrow lots that run east-west. That's hard. That's a hard configuration to use to get a lot of parking in there. So we'll see developers come in, purchase a couple of adjacent lots, knock down buildings on both, essentially combine that lot, put one building on it, and use the additional space for parking. So we also see shifts in how people are developing the parcels, regardless of what the lot boundaries look like now. So we have to see a definite shift there. And we also see a lot more commercial development, new commercial development happening, but it's continuing north, so starting at 200 north and continuing to migrate, just like it's doing today. The new strip malls and everything, right, are showing up to the north of the downtown area. And so that's where we started to see the bulk of the new commercial development occurring, but some did occur in the district at that time. We really don't see much in the way of residential development in the district during this period. Excuse me. So we have 21 resources left in the district from this period. 14 are contributing, 7 are non-contributing, and essentially no new residential development. We do see, in terms of the structures, we see that World War II era styles, so those boxy, less adorned styles at the beginning, moving into modern architecture, so things that have those the elements of modern architecture, which also tend to be a bit boxy in many cases. And then ultimately some of the late 20th century styles where you would see, if you remember, you know, things like the late 1960s or early 1970s, those mansard roof, you know, type things. Look, Paul's got this look like, yeah, I don't like those either. But yes, we start to see some of those. And again, we have this accommodation of vehicles that changes kind of the scope of things. Two of the more notable buildings that are more unique, I would say more unique from this period would be the Quonset hut that was actually a 1955 structure. It's over on 50 West. So it's not overly visible within the district since it's kind of on a mid-block alley, if you will. And then the Key Bank building, one of the unique circular bank buildings that were part of a trend that started occurring nationwide. I think the earliest one was about late 50s back east, and then they continued heavily developed into the 60s and then into the 70s.
The upper floor then is after that.
Yeah, yes, it is. So the district's significance, if you recall, Corey was talking about the criteria under which the district or a resource can be listed on the National Register. This district has 2 that apply. Criterion A, basically as a representation of the patterns of development of Intuila's history, especially in the area of commerce. It's commercial development. That's the kind of the key there. And then under Criterion C is a strong collection of architecture, primarily commercial architecture, it's the hallmark of that period of significance. And that is just the quick overview. If anybody's got questions, I'm happy to take them. I can make up answers to anything.
The architecturally significant ones, like, just like looking at that, like that building, those are like unique architectures. So that's that criterion, right?
Well, it's basically what gets used in reconnaissance level surveys, which are the types of surveys that are used to evaluate whether there's enough there for a district. They primarily are basing on age and integrity. So is it old enough?
Yeah.
50, is it 50 years old or older? And is it readable to its period to the historic period and its period of significance? So how badly has it been messed up?
So it's always been related to commercial rather than any residential.
Well, as I showed you, those by around, you know, from 1910 and prior, and then up to about the 1930s, the northern part of the district had quite a bit of residential activity or use in it. There were quite a few properties. There were a handful of properties on the southern part of the district that were also residential. Some of them are still there. There's still a few left on the northern part of the district too. There's like 2 or 3 up there on the west side of the road, tucked in there, and you almost don't notice them because of all the commercial development around them. You're sort of walking along, go, there's a house. So yeah, but as the time went on, those residential structures got demolished and commercial structures were put in their place.
And so barely outside of our defined district, and maybe you can help me understand, is that typically how all these historic overlays work in other cities where you go half a block further and we've got plenty of buildings, it's all residences?
Yes. Yeah, so historic districts, it's really kind of up to the proponent, the sponsor, what you want to preserve. But you need to find, you're looking for areas that have a collection of old enough buildings that have some cohesiveness to them. Some tie together in history usually. That they're all influenced kind of by similar patterns or similar economic things, economic occurrences. So you can decide you just want to have a primarily commercial historic district, which a lot of communities do. They'll be their, downtown commercial historic district, or there's something like that, a Main Street district. That's a very common theme, and those tend to be primarily commercial. You can expand out from there and include residential if you want, or you can do an area that's just residential.
Has that ever been discussed? I'm new to this. whole
Yeah,
thing.
so
Yeah, no, good
this is all
question.
handed to me
Yeah.
as the desired district. So I don't know, I don't have the history as to why this particular area was chosen versus
Yeah.
the residential.
That's what I'm trying to get.
Which, as you
Yeah.
say, yes, you could draw a square around, any block, kind of.
Well, you go one block further. and it's
Exactly.
1929 Central School.
Yes.
Apartments, so you've got almost all that.
Yes, there's huge areas of Tooele that you could put a big bubble around and say yes, because they all date to that
Mhm.
period. Looks like Corey is leaning in and has something to say.
Or-
Yeah, so some of it I can't really hear, but as we were driving around Tooele, there's a pretty good potential for a residential historic district there. What I found out more recently is, a lot of our smaller cities have done a full citywide historic district. Recently, like Brigham City is just in the process of one, Tremonton just did one, but we've had a million cities, and I just found out that the folks at the National Register Office who review these are not super hip on those kind of districts. They like more measured districts that don't, that aren't like the whole community unless it's super small. So I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure what the process was that got this started for us to go survey the downtown area. But driving around the outside area, I think you have a pretty good potential for a residential district, especially west of the downtown area. So that would be something you want to look for, maybe doing a survey out with a future, grant to see just what the level of, significant to or eligible non-contributing properties is.
And that could be great projects for the future is to do another survey and expand it. This kind of came from our 2019 survey. None of us in the room here were actually involved in that.
Yeah.
So, there's maybe, I think Richard Trujillo on our commission, he was in the group in 2019, but that's a hard one to answer because I don't know how those boundaries were actually chosen. And, we did expand it a little bit to include the Chamber of Commerce building and, there's, I think like the old Central School. Yeah, and Kirk Hotels individually listed on the district too, on the.
Yeah.
Yeah, that happened. That Kirk Hotel started all this, I think. Because we, went through that nomination and then somebody contacted Roger Roper, who's retired now. And so just said I don't know who it was there that he talked to, but he said, yeah, we could probably just go do that. Since it's a small area, we typically don't do surveys of towns, especially if they have a certified local government that can get a grant to do that. But since there were so few properties, said we can just go do this. We did it in one day and kind of chose the boundaries based on what we saw. Things started to thin out really bad, or there was a lot of newer construction outside those the commercial district boundaries. But yeah, I would think, for a future grant that you get one to do a survey of, I don't know if you could do the whole city in one grant, but possibly, but the areas outside of this historic district.
You always want to think about to what end, right? Why do you want to establish a historic district? Is it to incentivize people to preserve structures? Is it, help them get tax credits? Is it part of your redevelopment? What is it you want to accomplish by it? And that also can help you kind of determine to some degree on, think about your boundaries or areas of the community that you actually want to focus on surveying, maybe looking into a district there. The boundaries can be, they can get out of control really fast. I mean, they said you could include an entire community. That's kind of hard to manage in some ways too, when, depending on what your goal for a district is. And I mean, in some ways, like the bigger it is, the more likely that, it's gonna get chipped away at. And you're gonna end up, it's because if you don't have local ordinances, and I'm not encouraging you to, I'm just saying, if you don't have them, people can still do whatever they want with their properties. They can sell them and then be redeveloped, all of those things can happen. And the sort of the bigger the area, the more that gets carved up. And then you end up with these weird little pockets of, this pocket's good, this whole area is bad, that whole pocket's good, so it's, smaller districts tend to be a lot more manageable in terms of kind of keep preserving them in a way. So it's just not what you want to accomplish.
I realize the math is wrong.
Should
Should have been 93,000 for a $350,000 project.
Still.
Just wanted to clarify. I'll fix that slide and resend it to you.
Yeah, no, I think this gives us a lot of like future projects I wrote, we can do more surveys. We can do outreach about tax credits to the eligible properties and help connect them to Amber and then we can look at, okay, what's not in this district and should we pursue individual listings? Should we look at expanding the district? There's a lot we can do with this. I did want to ask you, Corey, what's next in terms of this project and this nomination? I know you go to like a meeting with the National Park Service, and what does it look like for us next?
So next, on May 18th is the state's National Register Review Committee meeting. And there's a link to that was sent in your notification letter. We have also placed that in the Tooele newspaper. It should have come out by now, but feel free to share that link if you have a city-wide newsletter that goes out email or something. Let them know, and they can join that virtual meeting. It's kind of anticlimactic because the committee members read the nominations before the meeting, and then I do a really quick presentation just covering the very basics for about 10 minutes, and then they vote based on their review whether it meets the standards to forward to the National Register, or if it needs some work before it gets sent off. If there's questions that need to be addressed before we send it off. That's May 18th. And then, so if they approve it, it takes about a couple weeks to get all those nominations packaged up, properly formatted, then it's submitted to the National Register. And then they have 45 days to review it and list it. Or if they have comments that need to be addressed, they may send it back. But in all, it should be about 60 days after the May 18th state meeting before we hear if it's listed or not. And then I'll notify you again. We'll send out another public notice once that happens.
Okay,
So we're
so
looking
by
at end of
mid-July,
July. Yeah,
yeah, end of July, we'll have a hopefully historic district, and we can kind of start planning next steps of outreach and stuff. So, okay, great. Other questions, thoughts? I know we're past our time we thought we'd be at. But, I had it on the agenda, CLG update. If we look back at our minutes, our downtown master plan, we did an open house that I think you all were there for. We should have that master plan done. It says April 2023 in January. That's when we thought it would be done, but everything takes a little longer than we expect it to sometimes. So that'll probably be next month by the time, but they're drafting that now. The only other update really on our Railroad Museum project updates, we do have new windows, the glass ordered, and I don't know if it's installed yet, but I know we've already purchased the orders and paid for the work for Phil's Glass to repair broken windows at the Railroad Museum. So those are our updates, still working on some other stuff, so that's it. Okay,
All right. Well, thank you.
hey, thank you, Corey, appreciate you joining us.
All right. Good luck, everybody getting home. Hope there's no accidents again.